and welcome to the Election Show on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer. I'm an associate professor of political science at Fordham University and the co-host of the podcast FAQ NYC. Joining me today via Zoom is Matt McDermott, communication strategist and vice president of Whitman Insight Strategies. And also with me is political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. Hello, gentlemen. It's always great to spend a Wednesday with you. How are you all?
Good to be with you.
We're all just moving slowly but surely around New York and elsewhere. So let's just jump right in. So let's start with the president's 4th of July celebration extravaganza at Mount Rushmore, Sacred Lands in South Dakota. Lincoln, I'll start with you. The president didn't necessarily have a unifying message. I don't think anyone was surprised about that. But there's quite a bit of controversy about him going to such sacred land to the Lakota people who've been protesting, not just this president, but his administration and some of the environmental and political atrocities that he wants to commit. What did you make of that 4th of July speech and what some would argue is his doubling down on kind of a white nationalist populist message?
Well, that is exactly what he's doing. Trump has, from the beginning, Trump's to hurt people of color, to say things that are offensive to people of color, to gay people, to Jews, has been criticized, but to Muslims, to others. We don't have enough time to talk about all the groups. But it is important to note that this is a feature of Donald Trump. It is the thing he can deliver to his base. It is not a bug. So to go and make a racist speech on the 4th of July is good. That's what Donald Trump's base wants to hear from him. But to do it in a place that is offensive, in this case to Native American people, makes it even more powerful and more appealing to his base. Trump is desperate right now. He cannot run on an economy. He cannot run on his handling of COVID-19, but he can run on his racism. That's all he has. And we're going to see him go back to that well over and over between now and November.
So Matt, I mean, Lincoln brings up a really important point about him speaking directly to his base. But I mean, you're the strategist of all strategists. His base isn't over 50%. So explain to us the electoral strategy of talking to 35 to 40% of the voting population.
There is no strategy. I can't be more blunt about it. And honestly, I think after this election, we're going to hear a heck of a story from his campaign team about what transpired over the course of this year, because it's baffling to anyone that's watching it from the outside. He cannot win this election without growing his support among a set of voters that he did not win in 2016. At this point, he's not even holding voters he won in 2016. And part of that is because he has in his head that by speaking to his base, he can energize this cohort of voters, which will, I guess, swell him to victory, when the reality is that he's always had to win a cohort of persuadable voters. And he, I think, to the frustration of Democrats, did that in 2016. His platform in 2016 was actually pretty moderate. He had this contract with the American voter that talked about massive infrastructure projects, about bringing fairness into our education system, about bringing equity and affordability into our healthcare system. He actually, beyond the racist tropes and the speeches he had as at his rallies every day, had a platform that was actually pretty moderate on the issues. He's accomplished none of those things in the last 4 years. And so that voter that might have been persuaded to vote for Donald Trump in 2016 is looking at his campaign right now and thinking, who is this guy? And how does he think he's going to lead this country moving forward? His speech on the 4th of July was anything but unifying, as Lincoln mentioned. And so it's just a perplexing strategy heading into November. And you can see now in a number of reports, the New York Times, Rolling Stones had a piece on this week, a number of Republican strategists close to the White House completely perplexed by this strategy because it's not one that can actually win them the White House in November.
Right, and it's a strategy that actually might lose them the Senate if they're not careful. So I do want to go back to this article, this Rolling Stone article that you mentioned, because it was 9 GOP strategists that essentially said, what is he doing? And we are in for, as to quote President Obama, a shellacking at the very least. So Matt, I want to stick with you as a strategist. Why aren't these people sort of standing up and saying things to protect their party why do we see this allegiance and this loyalty to someone who, thinking of the president, who doesn't really seem to care about the party, he cares about himself and his rhetoric, but he's damaging the future of the Republican Party in ways that they may not be able to come back from. I mean, he's essentially saying, we're doubling down on racism, not just racist tropes anymore. This is just the old school, Jim Crow level racism.
And I hate to be cliche in metaphors, but they're all standing on the Titanic right now and watching it go down. And no one seems to be raising a hand or raising a flag to try to stop this. And I think to your point exactly, the real concern for Republicans is the future of this party after this election. You can see in fundraising numbers that were released this week for Senate Democrats are raising tens of millions of dollars in Senate races that no one thought competitive. In South Carolina this week, against Lindsey Graham, it was announced the Democrats were able to raise close to $14 million.
This is for Jamie Harrison, the African-American challenger to Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, is outraising Lindsey. Mm-hmm.
And outraising incumbent Republican senators in places like Iowa, in places like Montana, in places like Arizona, in places like North Carolina, in places like South Carolina and Georgia. The map for Senate Democrats now suddenly looks amazing, when if we were talking 6 months ago, we would have been hard pressed to pick up a seat or two in the Senate, just given what we thought the map looked like. And so there's a wave building here. Whether that wave turns into a tsunami heading into November, I think remains to be seen. But at the moment, this is a pretty dire circumstance for Republicans. And the only way that they can get out of that hole that they're in right now is one of two things. Either the president changes his tune and starts talking to persuadable voters, which doesn't appear to be possible given the last 4 years that we've endured, or Republicans start to jump ship. And you start seeing, particularly in the Senate, Republicans like Mitt Romney, who have always sort of, been sort of on the more moderate wing of the party, stand up and say, this is insane, we're going to lose the presidency in the Senate, and somebody needs to speak up to prevent that from happening. But at the moment, neither of those two things is happening, and it doesn't look like either of them is going to happen in the near future.
Well, Lincoln, thank you, Matt, because Lincoln, we see people like Mitt Romney. I mean, they'll stand up, but sporadically, and it's not emphatically. Matt, I might argue that there's a third path, and that's cheating. So, either the president changes his tune, Republicans start to jump ship, or they figure out that there are places and ways, we already have data from Wisconsin and Kentucky, where there are ways that you can have voter suppression, you can have voter disenfranchisement, and you can cook the books to make sure that even though you're not in the lead, you end up with the win. Lincoln, what do you have to say to sort of Matt's analysis about Trump going forward and his party?
A few things come to mind. First, I don't think they have three ways. I think they have one way, and that's the one that you outlined. That's the only card they have to play. Now, Matt talked a little about the strategy that Trump could use, but it's important to note that the election is almost 4 months away. There still is some time, not a lot. The problem is Trump is not driven by a strategy of how do I win this election. Trump is driven by a strategy of what do I do to feel good in this moment. And that is what his campaign team, such as it is, has been kind of bullied into doing. So why would you have that rally in Tulsa? Even if it's high attendance, it's not going to change any voters, but it makes Trump feel good. And that's the level on which this is operating. As far as the Republican Party, my sense is it is too late to break from Donald Trump. They've had opportunity once, and particularly once they all, with the exception of Mitt Romney, stood by him at the moment of the impeachment hearing. They're not going to break with him now. They are, in some sense, co-conspirators. They have worked with him to drive the party in this direction. What is Lindsey Graham's speech going to sound like if he breaks with him today? He's already been silent about the bounties that Russia has been placing on American troops, about which Donald Trump knew. Once you're silent on that, you're pretty far down this path. And that is true of Graham. It is true of McConnell. It is true of almost all these people. And the third piece of this is that already we're beginning to hear people positioning themselves for 2024. And some of these names are more plausible than others. I mean, these names run the gamut from Mike Pence as an obvious person, Nikki Haley, who has an appealing resume, Tucker Carlson, who is a racist clown on the kind of scale of a Donald Trump, and Donald Trump Jr., who is, and this is hard to explain in a serious way, not even as smart as his father, right? But for any of those people, or Tom Cotton, or all the others you could think of, if you push away the Trump base now, you can't get through a Republican primary. So if you have a safe, if you're not up this year, if you have your seat taken care of, you know, in your heart, they probably know that Biden would be a better president than Trump. They don't want this pandemic to kill another 200,000 people next year. So they can certainly live with Joe Biden. They want to protect themselves, keep their mouths shut, and then have a shot in 2024 primary. This is not exactly patriotism. It's not exactly courage, but there's a political rationale to it.
And let me, I just was going to make a point on your question, Christina, because I think it's so important, and you can see it now happening in Republican circles in terms of, you know, propelling this notion that mail-in voting is somehow not safe and secure. And the reason they're doing that is simple, as if you just look at the margins in 2016. If the exact same electorate turns out in 2020 as in 2016, the exact makeup of white voters, the exact makeup of black voters, et cetera. If that exact same electorate turned out in 2020, Joe Biden would win Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, just on the basis of demographic changes that have happened there in the last 4 years. That's not taking into account voters that have been persuaded to leave Donald Trump. That's not taking into account new voters. That's not taking into account, you know, voters that weren't mobilized in 2016 that were mobilized this year. Just simply based on demographics, Democrats would pick up Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And so that's why these suppression efforts are happening. Because just on the basis of demographics, if Republicans aren't able to suppress voters who are now considering Democrats, they'll lose this election. And so I think we just need to be cognizant of that moving into November, because that will turn into their number one effort. Is if they can't win the election fairly, they're going to try to win the election by depressing turnout in states that are important to them. And Democrats should be up at the soapbox calling that out at every way possible.
Yes, I mean, I wish they would. I mean, we've seen it, you know, as these test runs during the primaries, and I see that as their strategy, because their messaging is so exclusive and offensive to a lot of people. And I think that a lot of white Republicans in particular were fine with the tax cuts. They wanted to just sort of turn a blind eye to children in cages and the rhetoric about building a wall. And now it's just, you can't ignore it. And so either you are on the side of a white supremacist, white nationalist, someone who says racist things unapologetically, or you're not. But Lincoln, you said something that I wanted to get both of you to comment on. So we've been meeting every other week for several months now, which is a highlight of my professional career, I must say. But each time we get together, the numbers of Americans who have died from the coronavirus increases pretty substantially. And so we've seen, even in the past 2 weeks, the numbers of people who are newly infected, the numbers of Americans who are hospitalized, and also the numbers of deaths keeps just exploding. And the window of these thousands of deaths keeps getting shorter and shorter. So I want to start with you, Lincoln, but I want both of you to sort of walk me through what this looks like, if you can, for the rest of the summer and leading up to the election, when we have this global pandemic and a real partisan division as to how we get out of this. Somehow, Dr. Fauci has been benched. Somehow wearing a mask and social distancing has turned into a Democrat versus Republican issue that we've not seen in other countries. Somehow the belief in science and that the coronavirus can seriously kill people is real, and some don't believe in it. And even those who attended the rally, the president's rally in Tulsa just a few weeks ago, said that they knew people who had died of the coronavirus, but it didn't bother them, and they didn't see it as a pandemic. So Lincoln, explain this disconnect and explain how the president keeps just moving through the fact that we have almost 200,000 Americans who've died. And in comparison, we had under 3,000 Americans who died during 9/11.
It is an extraordinary moment. And there's a lot to your question. There's an epidemiological question there. There's a political question. There's a psychological question. And, I just want to give one example. I have a friend who's in his early 70s, and he's okay, but he has some underlying health issues. His wife also has some underlying health issues. And this man is very cautious. He rarely leaves the house except to walk the dog. He wears a mask. He wears gloves when he goes out. And now he's been called back to work, and he's stressed out about that. But one thing he said to me someone who's walking his dog was, you go out every day and you're okay, and you begin to think you're immune, but of course you're not. And so that is a psychological dynamic that works with all of us. Now, a competent government, and we do see this at the state and local levels in places throughout the country, would push back against that and remind people to take the public safety precautions. But we've had the exact opposite. And for rough numbers here, 30 to 35%. And remember, the people who agree, 35% who are in the Trump cult, their leader is saying, essentially, this isn't real. And I suspect that, and again, I'm not a psychologist. I did talk to a Republican psychologist early on in this. This is kind of based on a little bit of what he said, but Trump won't believe in some core level that COVID-19 is real until and unless he gets it.
He himself, not his children, not his wife, not his son's girlfriend.
Not Mike Pompeo, not Jair Bolsonaro, he himself. And until that happens, he goes out there and acts as if it's not real, because in his addled and compromised mind, it isn't real. And that is the story of an old man who isn't well, and it's sad. And if he were just some dude, we'd say we should make sure he's protected. He is not just some dude. He's the president of the United States, and he's spreading what is a poisonous message. That message is not resonating with the American population. This is one of the reasons his poll numbers are so bad. Only about 30% of the American people really believe that this is nonsense and you shouldn't wear a mask and all of that. The problem is if 30% believe that, this pandemic isn't going to go away. But we also see this in his constancy. Let's open this. Let's open the schools. This week it's the schools. Everything that we open up exposes more people to death. Now we have to compromise and negotiate and navigate this, but we can't do that because a serious conversation about how and when it's safe just to pick the schools, which is perhaps the thorniest question, is impossible with Donald Trump in the White House just blaring out, open up the schools or I'll cut your funding. Schools aren't federally funding anyway. This is something he tweeted today. So this is very difficult. But what it means is that, now I'm supporting Joe Biden in this election. But so I'll just say that up front. So if Biden were to win and he becomes president, probably 250,000 people have died. And America is so damaged internally and in its standing in the world that it just makes an enormous task for him, much greater than looked like even 5 months ago.
Mm-hmm. Matt, what do you think? And especially because you're a consultant, and so from putting on your consultant lens, I mean, where do we go from here? Especially as you look at the states that Donald Trump would need high turnout. I mean, we see Arizona leads the world per capita. The story came out this morning. Arizona is number one. I think Baghdad is number 4. We've got Florida rampant. We've got Texas rampant. We've got the states throughout the South, and now the Sun Belt states as well. So what do you make of this from a political standpoint?
What's most depressing, frustrating, and for most Americans should just be infuriating is it's increasingly obvious that 25-something thousand New Yorkers essentially died in vain. They died in the early weeks of this crisis when we didn't know what was going on, when the government hadn't had an opportunity to put in place measures to prevent it. And it was a tragic and horrifying experience for those of us in New York, but nationwide. And I think the hope of us was that situation notwithstanding, other states would have the time to put in place protections, protocols to prevent it from happening in their own states. And it's now increasingly evident that those states didn't do that. In fact, they did the opposite of putting in place protections. They reopened their economies without any protection whatsoever. And now we're seeing the result of that. So we should all, frankly, be mortified about what happened. And I think moving forward, through the political lens, the just messaging from this president is so out of whack with the average American stands on this issue. On the issue that, Lincoln mentioned, education and reopening our schools this fall, you've got a president of the United States blasting these tweets out at all hours of the day, saying that every state and every city and municipality in this country must open their schools this fall because we can see, looking at Germany, that they've reopened their schools and they're not having an issue. Well, the problem with Germany is that in the last 24 hours, 300 cases of COVID-19 existed in Germany. 55,000 cases of COVID-19 are newly existing in the United States. The point of comparison isn't even relevant to the crisis we're facing in this country right now. And so I think any American voter heading into November, but frankly, just sitting at home with their family right now, should be looking at the situation happening globally and saying, why is it that every other country in the world right now is not faced with the situation that the United States is faced, and not just is facing at the moment, has consistently faced for 4 months. And it's not a local issue at this point. It's not a state issue at this point, because many states and localities have put in place a number of different measures, from mask usage, from requiring outdoor events, et cetera. It's a federal crisis, and it's a federal lack of leadership that's taking place. And any voter that doesn't see that at this point, is prioritizing other things in who they're determining should be our next president.
Well, sadly, Matt, I think that quite a few voters don't see it the way you've just sort of intricately outlined. I mean, the fact that we couldn't go to Europe if we wanted to, they don't want us, right? We are now the S-hole country that the president so loosely spoke about several years ago. I do think it's interesting, you said, when you're looking at all the other countries whose numbers aren't going down, because as you rightfully stated, this isn't a local or state issue anymore. This is a global pandemic that we have mishandled, and the rest of the world has to distance themselves from us. But I think it's fascinating that as we see the numbers get under control in a lot of countries, the two countries that are standouts are Brazil and the United States. And it's no surprise that the Brazilian Trump, Bolsonaro, A, has COVID, B, has chosen to still not wear a mask after being diagnosed with COVID, to speak to the press, and this rampant denial that both you and Lincoln spoke about is astonishing on so many levels. And then we haven't even mentioned, and I wanted to sort of get both of your reactions on this, we have also now let the UN know that we would be withdrawing from the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic. So, Lincoln, how does that play with the base, the moderates, and then the Biden folks? Because I think we know the obvious answer, but I want you to sort of walk us through this major decision to leave the World Health Organization in the midst of almost 200,000 Americans who have died in the past 4 months.
Well, I'm going to add a fourth category, which is the rest of the world, because that's important here as well. So, this is straightforward. I think leaving the World Health Organization, does the effect exactly what you would think. The base likes it because America first, that old pro-Nazi slogan from the early 1940s. The Biden people, this just confirms what people think about Donald Trump. And the people in the middle, this is a message that Trump is overwhelmed by the pandemic, that he's unable to kind of understand what's really going on. And there certainly are criticisms to be made of the World Health Organization. Indeed. But now is not the time to walk away. Perhaps the biggest impact is the message this sends to our allies.
Or now, former allies.
Yeah, well, our erstwhile allies. And Joe Biden, we don't want to talk a lot about foreign policy in American elections this year in particular for obvious reasons, but Biden is running as a kind of conventional liberal internationalist Democrat on foreign policy, who has said a few times, I want to come in and rebuild what Donald Trump has destroyed. But things like withdrawing from the World Health Organization make it harder. Not because Biden can't turn that decision around in a minute when he becomes president, because he can. But what it tells the rest of the world is that you can no longer depend upon the United States. Once a country has a flirtation, and this is more than a flirtation, and you can fill out that metaphor however you want, with authoritarianism, with domestic instability. Once it does that once, it can no longer claim to be the rock of stability and the rock of, to the extent we were, democracy. Once we lose that, that is our most valuable asset in the international world through the rest of the world. That is why we have friends. That is why we can lead on so many issues. Once you lose that once, you lose it forever. We are just another country now that has had a dalliance with authoritarianism, and with instability, and hopefully that will wind down in January of 2021. But we will never be the same again. And withdrawing from the World Health Organization is one more brick in that wall. And that wall, pardon the metaphor, because I know Trump likes wall, it doesn't wall them off from us, it walls us off from them.
Right.
That's very damaging for us economically, politically, militarily, with regards to national security, with regards to future pandemics, with regards to climate change, et cetera.
Yes, I mean, that was always my fear, that the global community would move on without us, especially with this America First rhetoric that some Americans embrace so freely. But I was definitely afraid that coalitions would be formed, especially as we have dalliances with dictators across the globe who were never our allies, and now they are our new allies, and we've abandoned so many members of the EU, especially, who have worked so closely with us. Matt, as we sort of start to wrap up, what do you make of our sudden departure from the WHO in the middle of a global pandemic?
You couldn't come up with a political strategy that's less in tune with a middle of the road voter. I mean, to be blunt about this, there are a large number of voters, millions of voters, largely in the suburbs, largely white women, who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 because they could look past the racial resentment or accept it so long as they got a tax cut, so long as they got $1 trillion in infrastructure projects, so long as their schools' education was more fair and healthcare was more accessible. That was the message of Donald Trump in 2016. There's no way to look past the problems at this point. And beyond just the fact that he's a racist and a misogynist and whatever else, for that swing voter, for that white woman in the suburbs, they're now looking at Donald Trump as a threat to their family, and they're a threat to their children's not only future, but current health and well-being. And so this is, I think, a real inflection point for the country, because like it or not, as you know, Democrats, all of whom of us are, you know, pretty far on the left, there is a group of voters out there that on the issues, you know, kind of likes Donald Trump. But at this point, he's literally, not just figuratively, literally putting the public health and well-being at threat. And so voters are looking at the situation through a very different light and thinking to themselves, my God, like, what does another 4 years of this look like? And so it's not even just that they like Joe Biden or like his policies. At this point, they're quite literally voting on the future health and well-being of themselves and their families, and seeing Joe Biden as the only option that protects that moving forward. So it's just, we're in a very different realm right now than we were in 2016, largely because we're facing issues that none of us ever thought we'd be facing in our own lifetimes, that is threatening the health and livelihoods of each of us individually in a way that we've not seen previously in our lifetimes.
Well, thank you, Matt, for laying that out. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. I wish we could end on a brighter note. I mean, we do need to remember that white women have voted for the Republican candidate every single election from 1952 to the present, only with the exception of 1964 with LBJ and 1996 with the second term of Bill Clinton. So we will see how that vote that you just laid out actually goes. So joining me today via Zoom is Matt McDermott, communication strategist and vice president of Whitman Insight Strategies. Also with me is political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University, Lincoln Mitchell. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You've been watching the election show on MNN. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Thanks again.